Beans, when I say beans, I'm kind of using it as a blanket term for pulses and other legume crops. But essentially, most legume seeds that we call beans and pulses have got this wonderful mix of really complex carbohydrates for slow release energy, as well as a really kind of wide array of amino acids in the forms of proteins that are really essential for human health. So most people, when they think of legumes, they think of protein and getting the proteins they need. And when you go to the supermarket or shop to buy, let's say, vegan alternatives to meat, it's always the protein side that they stress. But I think what's missing from that picture is the nuance that legumes, beans and pulses have got this really amazing kind of package. They come in a package that has both the protein, which is one aspect only, but also the minerals, the complex carbohydrates that are so good for gut health, and so many other benefits, like fiber, for example. When we're talking about planetary health, we're thinking, or I'm thinking, climate change and reducing our impact, human impact on planetary systems. And legumes play a huge role in that in farming because of their ancient symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria called rhizobia or rhizobial bacteria. And what these legumes do is that they kind of make a friendship with them in their roots, so that the bacteria that can access nitrogen in the air, and the air is about 70% nitrogen, but that nitrogen is essential for production of proteins. We get our nitrogen from proteins in our diet. Bacteria can get nitrogen from the air. But the problem with plants is that most plants get nitrogen from the soil in the form of nitrates. Now, if you're a legume, you bypass that problem of trying to obtain soil nitrogen because you've got access to the nitrogen in the air. And that nitrogen in the air comes from this friendly relationship with soil bacteria in these root nodules that legumes have. And that is key to this whole process of legume benefits for farming, for planet. Because when you've got a plant that doesn't rely on getting nitrogen from the soil, you don't have to rely as a farmer on inputs. And those inputs can be organic fertilizers, or they can be artificial synthetic fertilizers. Now, synthetic fertilizers have got a huge carbon and greenhouse gas kind of guilt associated with them, because it takes a lot of energy to produce synthetic fertilizers from the Haber-Bosch process, and it takes it releases a lot of nitrogen into the soil and into our water systems, which causes eutrophication. So you've heard of algal blooms that can completely deoxygenate water systems as well as seas. So all of that are knock-on effects of use of or overuse of these synthetic fertilizers. Now, if you've got plenty of legumes in your farming system, in your fields, then you don't have to use so many fertilizers to obtain those nitrogen benefits. So having rotation crops immediately benefits both the farmer because they're getting high yields, and also benefits the plant's immediate environment, the water environment, soil environment, and of course the atmosphere. Most plants respond to drought by shutting themselves down. So if you've got a lack of water, the first thing you want to do is conserve the water that you have. And that could be the water in the soil, or it could be the water in the plant tissues, in the leaves, in the roots. Most plants have what you call stomata. So they are pores that open and close. And these pores are on the surfaces of their leaves, and there's thousands, millions of pores on a plant. And pores open in the daytime usually to get the CO2 from the air that is then used in photosynthesis to produce the energy for growth. Now, when you open your pores as a plant, you also lose water. You need to lose water as a plant because you're drawing up that water from the soil to obtain the nutrients, to obtain more water, and to kind of generally drive the plant's system. Now, you also need that water loss for cooling, because if you're sweating, as we do on a hot summer's day, we are sweating because we're maintaining ourselves at a cool temperature. And plants are the same. Plants have these pores. They lose water through evaporation, transpiration, and that cools the plant. So if you are suddenly in a situation as a plant where you don't have enough water, then the first thing you do is you close your pores. You close those stomata. But that suddenly means you can't get your CO2 to produce the sugars you need. And it also means that you can't cool yourself down. So if it's drought plus heat, then there's a serious problem. So most plants respond to drought immediately by closing their pores, by stopping water loss, and then over time they will pretty much kill off their older leaves to obtain to kind of clamp down. And legume crops are the same. Now, the problem with legume crops, of course, is that they've got other mouths to feed. They've got their symbiotic bacteria in the roots, and those symbiotic bacteria come at a cost, and that cost is carbon. So what that relationship is, I'll take nitrogen from you, but the bacteria want to take carbon from them to maintain that hungry nitrogen fixation process. So if you're losing water and you close your stomata to stop that from happening, you can't give the carbon dioxide in the form of sugars to your symbionts. So that relationship also then suffers. So there is evidence, though, that this symbiosis itself, so having nodulation, can be protection against water deficit, against droughts. So it's a complex system, but at the end of the day, they can't get something for nothing. So what you do as a plant is you cut off that relationship, and you don't, those nodules eventually die under drought. So what we're trying to do as plant scientists, as researchers, is to try and understand that process under stress to be able to find ways that the plant can cope with that stress better, maintain photosynthesis for longer, keep productivity high, and keep that nitrogen fixing relationship intact. Genomic tools it's just like a blanket way of saying, trying to understand the genomes of plants. So what diversity is there across species, within species, in land races. Genomic tools are just a way to find out what diversity is in that individual plant and compare that individual plant with other plants. So one thing we are really interested in at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew is to understand and kind of capture that diversity of of crop plants as well as crop wild relatives. And domestication, which has been taking place for, maybe over 10,000 years, the domestication process across so many plants just naturally means that you're narrowing the gene pool of the plants you're interested in. So every domesticated plant, almost without exception, has got a much, much smaller gene pool, i.e. much less diversity than its wild relatives. And that's because humans are selecting for what they need and what they want over, thousands of years. But there is also a problem with that, because if you select for what you want in one environment, you're obviously not selecting for what you want in another environment. So when environmental change occurs, as in climate change, then you're suddenly, as a plant, in the wrong place to what you're evolved to do, to what you've been adapted to do. So plants can't move around by themselves very easily, and humans can move plants and have done very successfully from continent to islands throughout their migrations. And what we've got now is lots of plants that we've domesticated, but actually we rely only on a handful of these plants. And this handful of plants you can list as wheat, rice, corn. There are lots of grasses, lots of cereal crops, and that's because they are a great source of protein, carbohydrates, for many people. But the problem with reliance on so few that have been bottlenecked into this domestication, and further since the Green Revolution of the 1930s onwards, have been bred into more and more elite varieties that are super good at producing high amounts of food for ever more mouths to feed, but only under this kind of mollycoddling situation that is modern farming, where you have to have very high inputs of fertilizer, of water and herbicides, pesticides, etc. So we're very good at making food. We have mastered farming, but that comes again at a cost, because that farming is so high input that it's unsustainable, and it damages other components of that agri ecosystem. So we need to work out a new way to farm just as intensively, if you like, or more intensively, in fact, but with the knowledge of the impact of what that does, and changing our way of doing it. And one way of doing that is increasing the diversity. So using genomics, and going back to your question, using genomics, we can look at the diversity that is in crop wild relatives, the diversity that is in our crop species that are underused. So that could be land races of beans. It could be wild or semi-wild and domesticated, even wheats and corns that we don't use enough. And those have in them the traits that may protect us against the stresses that we're now facing thanks to climate change. So there's quite a few people working on biodiversity in crops from a genomic perspective at Kew. So we've got Rafael Gutica, who works on domestication of rice and other cereals, as well as underutilized plants, crop species. So there's quite a few of us that are working in this space. Yeah. I'd say there probably are. I'm not a nutritionist, so I don't know the finer details of the amino acid profiles comparing them between different legume crops. I would also say, though, that if you're trying to diversify your diet for your own health, then adding a diversity of legumes is the key. So it's not just, oh, I must eat legumes, so I'm just going to eat chickpeas all the time, or I'm just going to eat beans or lentils, or, you name it. What I think is key for human health, gut health, is diversity in our diets as well. So have as many different types of legumes as possible, and at least one or two different types a day, I would say. Sure. So I've mentioned the nitrogen fixation part of the equation and reducing that need for artificial nitrogen in farming systems that use legume crops. But there's also another angle to it, because as a plant, when you have this relationship with soil bacteria, you have exudates, you exude, you pump out complex carbohydrates into the soil. So that's putting carbon back into the soil as well. So over time, a farmer who grows rotational legume crops is constantly putting carbon in the form of exudates back into their soils too. So, Latin America is a big space. You've got so many different biomes, so many different ecosystems, that I'm sure that there are many things we can learn about how farming has changed over the years. The Green Revolution basically kicked off in Mexico. So the Green Revolution at its heart was reducing the height of wheat, and by reducing the height of wheat, then it was not prone to lodging. It wasn't prone to falling down in the wind or heavy rains, and that was such a critical step in modern farming. So at its center, South America, Latin America have been driving lots of modern farming practices. And that's the same for Brazil, where they have huge mechanized farming methods, really intensive farming, very high yields, and modern systems. Now, there are obviously pros and cons of that, and that's a subject for a different time. But I think there's also lots of South America and North America, particularly Mexico, are feeling the brunt of climate change. And that's not just La Nina or El Nino weather systems playing up, causing massive droughts and then massive floods. It's also extreme heat. And this spring in Mexico was a classic example of where we're heading, where there's unprecedented temperatures above 40 degrees, above 50 degrees in some places in Mexico. And that has huge effects on yields. So there will be many areas in Mexico where they just couldn't plant crops, whether that's beans or maize or rice or whatever. And, that means people are not going to be able to afford to feed their family, or they're not going to be able to afford to stay in farming and instead migrate to the cities. There's huge demographic knock-on effects of these things that we're only just beginning to feel. But on a positive note, it also means that Latin America is adapting, and we can look at Latin America, and not just in terms of the diversity of crops they're adapting to, but also the ways they're adapting. So, land management, water management, all of those things we can look at and learn from. So I think it's two collaborations, if I can say two. So my project supporter during my PhD was Professor Julie Gray at the University of Sheffield, and she's an expert on stomatal development and stomatal physiology, so the pores that open and close on a plant. And it was collaborating with her and ongoing collaborations with her that have kind of driven my research focus. And also another collaboration with Professor Alejandra Covarrubias in the Institute of Biotechnology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM in Mexico City, and Cuernavaca, just south of Mexico City. That collaboration with her really drove my interest in beans and in Mexican farming and Latin American farming as a whole. I think that there is a really key component that is missing in our urgency and response to the climate emergency. And that is communicating that we need to do stuff like yesterday, now. And that message, I think, scientists have somehow been failing at. And I don't know if the failure is the scientists' communication with the policymakers, with the politicians. I don't know if that's a failure of scientists to engage with the public. I do know it is a failure of scientists to engage with the public, we don't know how to, but we don't have the skills to, we don't have the network to do that. And therefore, art and artists are a beautiful bridge by which somewhat detached messages from scientific research can be firmly embedded in people's lives, the real world, and how we can engage in the here and the now. So previously I've been working a lot on Phaseolus species. So Phaseolus is a genus of Pan-American beans, and Phaseolus beans include the runner bean. So that's Phaseolus coccineus, scarlet flowers, beautiful red flowers. People grow them in their allotments in the UK a lot. And then the common bean, or the French bean. Again, people are growing these right now while the weather's warm. And so they're all Phaseolus, and Lima bean as well. So butter beans, that's another Phaseolus that people will know. So previously my work's been working a lot on Phaseolus, and it still continues with Phaseolus. But in the last year or two, I've been getting increasingly interested in a completely different genus of beans called Vigna. And Vigna beans are usually known as kind of old world beans, even though there are Vignas in the new world as well. And Vigna beans includes Vigna unguiculata, so that's cowpea. So people know black-eyed beans, black-eyed peas, that's that. And then yard-long bean is also a Vigna unguiculata. So really, really long pods, like can't believe how long they are. It's amazing. And then other Vignas are azuki bean, rice bean, and what other ones that would people know? There's lots of them. And really, though my interest in Vignas is that there's this huge diversity that people have also domesticated and are a source of a lot of climate resilient traits. And there's another one, Vigna subterranea, which is the Bambara groundnut, which works like a peanut. So peanuts, they have flowers, and that flower then kind of droops to the soil, and the pod of the peanut is literally growing underground. So obviously peanuts are a bean, not a nut, and that pod is underground. And the same works with Bambara groundnut. So the flowers grow have the pods underground. And I'm really interested in those traits as well, because they have their heat stress and drought stress resilience that accompanies them. For the UK, I think the key is don't plant out too early. Right now, we have got such a weird weather pattern. And most people, they just, oh yes, it's the first day of sunshine of spring. Let's sow some seeds and let's put them in the ground, or oh yeah. But if you put a common bean seedling in the ground, it's not going to do anything until it's warm enough. And it'll just sit there, it'll get eaten, and you'll feel despondent and give up. So just wait just that little bit longer. And there's that phrase, like, near cast a clout till maybe out. So that means, don't shed off your winter clothes too early, and just because it's getting slightly warmer. So just wait that little bit longer, and it'll pay dividends, because that plant won't be grasping for life for the first weeks or months of its life, and instead it'll pay dividends. I became a vegetarian probably around the age of 11 or 12, so I was always interested in different ways to introduce alternative proteins into my diet. And I loved dals, and I loved, using beans a lot. And when I got older and started traveling, I really got into different foods, different cuisines. And then, on a personal level, my wife is Mexican, and obviously Mexican cuisine has at its center beans, corn, and squash as the three sisters milpa agriculture. So that's also part and parcel of the direction of my research. What I find most rewarding is the diversity of my projects, that I can work on really fundamental, basic science questions of how plants work, how they take up water, how they balance heat stress and drought stress. That's kind of mechanistic side of science. And then the applied, so I can translate those fundamental learnings to something that we can use in the field and in an agricultural setting. So it's that broad overview of the whole process from basics to crop to yield. That's particularly fascinating for me and keeps everything interesting. The way that the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew focuses on it is it has what are called TIPAs, TIPA, tropically important plant areas. So the tropics, of course, are very high diversity hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, and the same is true for agro-biodiversity. So you can have areas that are particularly important for agro-biodiversity, and Mexico is one of those. And that's why I think it's key, if we want to focus on the crop wild relatives, is to focus on those areas where we find them. And that includes West Africa, for example, and many other areas where we've got this unique mix of diversity in domesticated crops and their wild relatives. So I'm involved in a DEFRA funded project that works with an NGO called World Forest ID. And so part of my job at Kew is to look at the traceability of soybean in global supply chains, particularly in South American supply chains. And where people, I think, slightly misunderstand it is that almost all the soy that we import from South America and deforestation risk areas, that's not for human consumption. That's for consumption by poultry. It's just for, you're converting protein from soy into chicken protein. That's what it's for. So I don't really think that people having soy directly, whether it's in the form of edamame or whether it's in the form of soy sauce, I don't think that has a very significant impact on deforestation. Instead, I think the big significant impact is squarely in eating cheap protein from pigs and from chickens.